Welcome to the Chica Channel, where we are sharing the untold stories of revivalist women. Today I have my husband, Jeff Mathis.
Who is not a woman.
Who's not a woman. But I really felt like today I just wanted to have a conversation about why I feel like this is important, why I feel like it's important to get women's stories out into the world. And so I just felt like what better way than to have someone who knows
Have your husband ask you questions.
Knows me better than anyone, and he can kind of bring something out of me and ask me questions that maybe not many people could. So, hi.
What do you want me to do? You want me to share a little bit about what I do?
Yeah, we can give an intro
I'll
about our life.
give a little context. Well, we've been in missions you've been in missions longer than I have.
Almost 12 years.
Is it really 12
It'll
years?
be 12 years in September.
That's crazy. You're older than I am.
Yeah.
Noted. I've been in missions 8 years. We met in YWAM. You fell in love with me, and
whatever you got to tell yourself. You know?
That was pretty cool. I definitely had to kind of just like keep you just focused on God. You just kept hounding me. Finally, I was like, okay, fine, we'll go on a date. But no, I definitely fell head over heels for you, and we started dating. We got married. We led schools, these discipleship schools within our ministry. And we've been just radically following Jesus ever since. But one thing, I'm just going to gas my wife up real quick because I get to. But one thing I've watched you walk into, she didn't tell me to do any of this, okay? I just want to clarify this. But one of the things I've seen you, and I think this podcast is Rachel for so long, you for so long, have just constantly been a voice for women in our community. And I think, we're telling untold stories of women revivalists. It's like, well, I look at you as that. As a woman revivalist, someone who's really revered and looked up to within our ministry context. And I just think it's fun to watch you step into things that God spoke to you 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago.
2019.
I don't know. COVID felt like 20 years in 1 year, and I don't.
2019 was 4 years.
I don't really know. You're probably going to hear our neighbor sweeping her.
No, you can't. It's
fine. Maybe I think that would be. I'm Jeff. I work for YWAM.
We love it.
We fill stadiums and we mobilize and we work with the church and we do stuff with young people. That doesn't matter. This isn't about me. It's about the women revivalists. I think.
But we can't do without you. So we also need men.
I appreciate that. I think if I'm interviewing you, I think giving the context of at the Send in 2019 when God spoke to you about this, kind of like. What was the word? What did, how did even God speak to you? Yeah. I think that's even sometimes a foreign concept is like God speaking and us as his sheep being able to hear his voice and respond to his voice, and God using women, God using young people, God using people of color. Like this is one thing I love about the mission that we're a part of. And I think what's given you permission so much is that Lauren Cunningham and Darlene Cunningham, the founders of our organization, die on the hill of empowerment, of empowering women, of empowering young people. And I think that's been your story of finding your home in a community that empowers your voice. So maybe just talking about why do you even feel like you could start a podcast? Like right? Like that's like to some that just seems so aggressive. Like, oh wow, you're real pretentious. Like you think you can start a podcast, people want to listen to you, da da da. But like no, that's part of the DNA that we've grew up in ministry is that true. Women are believed in and you can hear God's voice. So maybe just like share with me and your audience. Like, how did God start speaking to you, and what made you even believe that you could? Obviously, it's been a journey because obviously God spoke that 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and we're just now getting here. So that's a process. That's a process, though. For sure. That's something you had to work through in finding a greater belief in yourself.
Yeah, definitely.
So maybe just like, I don't know, share a little bit of that journey.
Yeah. Okay. I think my journey with I think probably all of us can relate. Like, it feels like 1 year you're passionate about something and the next year it's different, or maybe it's like an overarching, like, here's what I feel like passionate about, or what I feel like God's like called me to do. But then it looks different in every season. And for us, we were in Orlando before the Send, and I just remember I was really working hard on a blog that I had just recently created.
Anthem blog. Check
blog.
It out.
It doesn't exist anymore. And I just was like, my friend and I basically were seeing all these areas of America that felt like we didn't see a ton of like biblical truth, like just permeating or influencing. And I remember seeing like so many fashion bloggers on Instagram or whatever it was. And I was like, gosh, I just feel like I'm seeing like broken women being inspired by other broken women. Like there's no broken women being inspired by like women who like know who they are and know what their identity in Christ is, or know like I have like the gospel and it's changed my life. And I just was like, where are those like gospel preaching like women of God that have tons of influence, maybe in their like close circles, but I don't see them on the platform of social media. And so I think initially one of my best friends and I just started doing a blog where we would talk about like fashion and travel and being a woman of God and like doing all these things. And then there was also like a aspect when we became moms, we started talking about motherhood. But I think in Orlando, I just was like really thinking about how so many women I know have such crazy stories, whether they were a missionary in Asia and they went through some crazy trials and hardship and they're still tender before the Lord. They love Jesus. They are willing to do whatever he says, and they've been through like hell and back. And I was like, I've heard like women's stories about having stillborns and then just like still like being obedient to have another baby, even though it was really scary to try again or whatever it was. And I'm just like getting around so many different women with all of these stories, and I'm like, these are like modern day revivalists, like, and no one will ever have access to them outside of really our community. And I just was thinking, I'm like, gosh, what would it be like to use if I could like serve them and get their stories out into the world, because these women are changing the earth, like changing the world, changing communities around them, and no one's hearing about them. And honestly, when I'm hearing their stories, it gives me greater permission to love God and to say yes to whatever he's asking of me, even if it sounds really crazy or if it sounds really difficult. And so essentially it was the call of feeling like I want to see social media transformed. And I know all of these legendary women, and what would it look like to get their stories out through a platform of like a podcast or through a YouTube channel, and how can I just like serve and get these stories out essentially. And I know nothing really about podcasting. I know nothing about, I mean, I was telling someone the other day, I'm like, I used to make like YouTube videos of like my best friend and I growing up, like music videos and dances and just different things, where I just learned how to edit videos and use media and how to like hack your MySpace layout code, like all those simple little...
My playlist.
The what?
My playlist. My Pandora playlist.
My Pandora playlist, you know, change your layout to be yellow or whatever. And I was like, I have all these random like basic minimum, like, I don't know if you can call them skills. I just have some little bit of knowledge. An understanding of like how some media stuff works. And I'm like, well, I guess I could start a podcast. And it wasn't even more like, oh, I want my voice to be heard. I totally feel unqualified for a podcast, for a YouTube channel. But I realized there's a need. Like these stories need to get out. And I'm like, if I was just at home or going to local church and I was living a great, happy life, and I would want to hear these stories. Like, and I have access to it being a missionary around other missionary women. And so I'm like, I want everyone to hear these stories. Like I would want to hear these stories if I didn't have access to them. So
because they're empowering.
They're empowering.
Like, I think it's even being around our community and some of the women that we get to talk to and go have meals with, and it's there's something that, right, testimony gives permission. Yeah. Right? When you hear a testimony of a mom of 5 kids who's had stillborns and has gone through really difficult things. This is one of our friends I'm sure you'll interview, just got back from Paraguay. Yeah. And is talking about how God moved. She has 6 kids. Like 6 kids. Even crazier. Right? we have to be careful to not get into competition and comparison. But if we can understand with the right heart of allow that to give you permission.
Yep.
And I think for us, it allowed us to take our kids to South Africa this year. Was we looked at, not in a weird comparison way, but there's people that have gone before us.
Yeah.
Like where maybe a model before is like, you know, the man just travels, the man just leads, the man just does ministry, which we've experienced that. And I do travel a ton and you are, you know, an incredible mother, but it gave us faith to take our whole family to South Africa because of someone in our community who'd gone before us, a family that had gone before us. And I think that's really your drive for this podcast is how can you share these stories that hopefully a young woman can hear.
Yeah.
And it's like, you know, who might be a mom at home and, you know, husband's a teacher, a doctor, a mechanic, like you name it.
Yeah.
Or a young girl who just graduated high school, a girl who's in high school.
Yeah.
And just to hear stories of women who are doing incredible things for God, not in a weird feminism, like, you know, crazy, like, I don't even know what we want to call it, but it is like, I get challenged by the women in our community.
Yeah.
And I think I'm just excited to hear some of those stories. I want to step into this because I think this would be encouraging.
Yeah.
It took you 4 years to start this podcast. I mean, of course, you and I have talked about that.
Yeah.
But what was that journey like of... Right, because we hear preach like delayed obedience is disobedience, you know.
I was probably disobedient,
but at the same time, you took steps. It wasn't maybe you know. I can say this as your husband. It wasn't delayed obedience. You did things.
Yeah, I tried.
That were like you tried and attempted.
Yeah.
So maybe and maybe talk about the trial and error, the disappointment in the midst of the trial and error.
Yeah.
And we're doing this podcast. We don't know if it's actually going to even be successful.
Totally.
Right. So doing things in faith, simple obedience. Maybe just talk about that journey.
Yeah. Yeah. It's taken 4 years to really.
Because you heard to do this podcast 4 years ago. It was a podcast.
Yeah.
Right. That's what God said.
It wasn't even like YouTube at this point.
Yeah. It was a podcast.
Now it's evolving.
It's gone through the blog. It's gone through Fashion Week. It's gone through all sorts of different things that you've done.
Yeah. Yeah. I think my personality type, like I get ideas a lot and then they don't always follow through. But
I think we can all relate to that.
Yeah,
like we can all relate to that.
Yeah. But I'll be the first to admit, like, I'm like, oh yeah, I don't finish like ideas that I get. And I think this one has remained in the midst of disappointment, in the midst of like my friend and I were trying to record some stories of some women. And like it ended up, we took like 6 interviews of women and all of the audio was like toast. Like it totally got messed up. And I just remember being like, what the heck? We literally had such awesome stories recorded. Like we took the time to do this. Like it was totally Holy Spirit led. Like just the conversations were incredible. And then it was just like all of it was gone. And I was like so disappointed. And then I have had 2 babies in the last 4 years. And so then in the midst of that was like, okay, I'm like super exhausted. I don't actually have the energy to try to like learn how to edit a podcast and upload it. Like it just was like the different seasons of my life that I was in, the discouragement of like, okay, we did this work to record all these stories and then they didn't even turn out. I think just kind of like every year was a different battle of like either discouragement or I don't feel like I have the capacity or energy to do it because I am a new mom of a newborn. And so I think now it's just felt like this window of time to just go for it. And I feel like I have.
And you could have given up. Like I would have been like, babe, I get it. Your friends would have been like, hey, we get it.
Yeah.
But you didn't.
And I just feel the importance of getting these women's stories out. I think that's what's like been like the constant, like an urgency, not feeling ungodly pressure in the urgency, but more like, God, these stories need to be released. And I know that they've transformed my personal life and I've just been around these women, some closer than others. But I think I just am like, gosh, if like my mom was hearing these things, she would be so inspired. And I just like, I think more than anything, I just want to provoke people and women into greater obedience and greater joy in obedience, and realizing like, yes, we're born to do hard things, but it can be done in joy and total surrender, and realizing the leadership of the Holy Spirit is so beautiful. And so I think I'm just like, more than anything, it's important to me to get these stories out, because I believe they're going to provoke a generation unto greater surrender and obedience.
That's it. That's it. And I think we've seen that in our own life. It's what I was saying earlier. Like, we've seen that in our own life. Like, I look at, one of my mentors in my life, who's taken on stadiums and done, and then fostering in the midst of it. And I'm sitting here like complaining about A, B, and C and why I can't get these things done. And not in a like condemning, because we got to be careful not to get condemned, because we see other people doing awesome things, and people do have different capacities. So you got to do what you are graced for. But at the same time, we love being safe. We love being safe. Like, I love not getting provoked. Because as soon as I get provoked means that I probably need to step out of my comfort zone, right? I get around my friend Frenchie, and he shares the gospel. He can say anything and people get saved and encounter God. And I get provoked. I don't want to hear those stories, because then I'm like, man, I'm not sharing the gospel. Not in a weird way, but I think in a healthy, like, I'm being provoked to do something. I think we have to get these stories out, because we have a generation of young people, both men and women, Christians, that have gotten really, really safe. And I think when we hear these stories, and even your own story, it's like, we cannot continue to remain safe. And when we hear testimony of other believers that are going wild after God and are doing hard and difficult things, it's like, man, it's going to provoke a generation to radical obedience, of course, in their own grace. Like, if you're a teacher, you probably can't just go to Paraguay and go to, but you can be more outspoken about your faith in your workplace.
And God's specific per call, like what you're called to, and I think, if anything, I've learned, and that's set me free so much, is like, okay, I have a friend that feels like she's called to move to India, and I'm like, okay, that's amazing, but I'm not going to hear her story and get insecure that I don't have a call to India. I'm going to say, God, her obedience is so provoking. What does this mean for me in my life? Like, I love the way she obeys God. I love the way that she's had courage in the midst of hardship and suffering, and God, what does this mean for me? Like, how can I let her life inspire me rather than feel jealous or insecure that I'm not doing enough, or that I'm not moving to India, but it being like, Jesus, like, what does this look like for me? Like, I feel called to women, I feel called to the youth, I feel called to America. God, what are my simple steps of obedience as I hear these types of stories from these women, from these men, whatever, that I can take from that and let the provoking produce obedience in my lane. Like, I think as Christians, as believers, God has us each in a lane of like what we're supposed to do, where we're supposed to carry, and we're supposed to own it and like be obedient in our own lane and go for it. And I'm not going to try to cross over into the like missionary in India lane. I'm not going to try to cross over into becoming a businesswoman, but it's like, okay, Rachel, what does God have for my life? What does this mean for me? I'm a full-time missionary with YWAM. I'm going to be moving to America mainland. I feel called to the youth. I feel called to women. I feel called to social media. God, what am I supposed to do with these types of things? And not being insecure about the lane that he has me in, but being like, God, how do I fully embrace and fully obey where you've called me to be?
And I think what's important too is redefining success.
Totally.
Right? Because success, like, let's say, stepping into social media, right? Success is hundreds of thousands of followers, right? But I think if we can redefine success as obedience,
absolutely,
then it doesn't matter how, like your blog, for example, like, it didn't blow up.
No,
it did not blow up. But we have testimonies of like high school students in Oklahoma that got radically touched by some of your, like, women who had miscarriages, heard our miscarriage story and were like, it like really impacted them to try again. Right. So it's like, you can't look at success as like, look at Jesus. Jesus had the most unsuccessful ministry ever. He had 12 guys, one totally rejects him, sells him out for 30 pieces of silver, and then all his bros leave him after he dies. Like the most failed church plant in history. But we sometimes think success looks like numbers.
Yeah.
Success looks like money. Success looks like position and power. But we have to, if we can reframe success as radical obedience to what we feel God is saying, and then reframing it of like, it's just like our son, Reese. He is being potty trained right now. Does he pee on the floor every once in a while? Yes, but he is trying to be obedient to the things that we're asked. Tell us when you got to go potty, buddy.
Yeah.
Right? Like I find so much joy in my son trying to follow my voice than being perfect at everything I'm asking him to do. He's a son. Like he's my child. Like he's 3 years old.
Yeah.
He's figuring it out. He's learning how to hear God's voice. And we could put so much pressure on ourselves to do everything so perfectly that it hinders us from stepping out in obedience.
Yep.
And I think that's what you've experienced over these last 4 years of just God reworking your framework of success.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So tell us, honey, what can we expect from the Chica Channel over the next few months? What are some of the stories, some of the people you're interviewing? Why should I tune into your channel?
I think there's just permission in all of these stories. I think I have one of my best friends who just a powerful story of staying with her husband in the midst of an affair. And I'm like, I've never heard of that. Like usually you hear,
that'll do something to you.
There's an affair.
Yeah.
Naturally it's justified to divorce. Like, you know, and she just talks about how in the midst of an affair, it wasn't even really about like, God, I pray that we get back together. But it was like, God, I pray my husband encounters Jesus.
Come on. Yeah.
And that just like wrecks me because it's like, that's the game changer, you know, like in the midst of her greatest pain that she wouldn't be praying selfishly, but she's praying, God, encounter my husband. And I just was like, that's a game-changing message that needs to be heard on the earth because no one's talking about like believing for their husband after they cheated on them, you know? And so I just was like, that's one of them. And I just am like, gosh, that's the game changer. Like that's the narrative that we need to release because that's going to provoke you. Like that provokes me. We've never experienced that in our marriage, but that provokes me to greater righteousness, to greater hunger for God. Like in the midst of a marriage, like there's disappointments and we fail each other, but like clinging on to like, if my husband fails me, God, give him a greater breakthrough with you. You know, like it's not, okay, I'm piecing out because you are struggling or whatever it would be, but just realizing like, dang, there's something that my friend Carrie has that I want an impartation of.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
You know, and so I think even like that's like one of the messages that I know will be released in the stories that will be released. But I think it's really just what to expect is permission to be allowing yourself to be provoked by these messages of these women of God who they're no joke.
Yeah.
They're changing the world. And I think that's more than anything. My heart isn't that someone would be sitting like home alone and comparing themselves to like, oh, look at all these great people I know. That's not my heart at all. It's we have permission to allow the Holy Spirit through testimony to provoke us into greater righteousness.
Yes, 100%.
And that's my heart. And that's what I hope that this podcast would be to provoke us. And even myself, as I re-listen to these messages, I'm like, gosh, do I love God? Like I have like all these crazy women around me. And if I can just like even remind myself like of the worthiness of Jesus through their story, through their like I'm stoked, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think that's one. I mean, so many of my friends have experienced loss and just people don't talk about that, you know? And I'm like, it's normal to talk about how hard and how awful like the loss of a baby is. Yeah. And so many people go through it and never talk about it. And I'm like, what if we just talked about it and talked about our response and our failures and then our awesome, like, I chose Jesus in the midst of the hardest time of my life, you know? And I'm like, that's really just the conversations I want to have and I want to make it normal. And and I want to release it to the world.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait to listen to every single episode.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
okay.
Of course it does. I'm going to listen to every episode, partly because I am your husband, but to be encouraged.
Thank you.
I'm glad I got to be on your first episode, honey.
Yeah, thanks for
allowing me.
Yeah, you are welcome.
I'm so glad I'm here in our home.
Glad to have you. Yeah, welcome to our house.